Okay, everyone, welcome. And oops, I just lost my page. Um, if you recall, in last week's lesson, we got to the end of Genesis 26. So I am going to start off with reading the last verse of that chapter in Genesis, and then the first two verses of 27, which will be our focus for today. Let me see. Of course, I had the page all set up to read, and then I closed the book. Okay. So the last verse of 26 says, when Esau was 40 years old, he married Judith, daughter of Beri, the Hittite, and Basmath, daughter of Elon, the Hittite. His wives became a source of spiritual bitterness to Isaac and Rebekah. And then if we go to chapter 27, Isaac had grown old and his eyesight was fading. He summoned his elder son Esau. My son, and Esau responds, yes. He says, I am old and I have no idea when I will die. So take your equipment, your bow and your dangler, and go out into the field to trap me some game. So up until now, up until this point in chapter 26, as I had said before, this was a really good time. It's a time of blessing for the Mishpachah. It was a time of blessing for Isaac, Rivka, and the boys. And it was a time of spiritual success for Isaac. As we had said, he, with thanks to Rivka, who was able to unify him and bring him into the side of mercy and wisdom and kindness. And there was blessings, and it wasn't this narrowness in their mishpacha and their experience. So we went through all of those blessings and the reasons and stuff for them, and then we end the chapter as that time of blessing is sort of coming to a close. So one lesson right off the bat is, when you're in a time of blessing and you've crossed the border and you've gained a level of consciousness on these, we call the Shloshim V'Shtayim Netivot Pliot, these magical 32 paths, right? As we cross that border, we don't want to get complacent, because when we get complacent, uh, can go away and can go from light to darkness. So the beginning of that is, for whatever reason, Esau wants to emulate his father, so he decides to get married after 40 years like his dad. But instead of inclining to the side of mercy and kindness with this choice, he inclines himself to the side of severity and cruelty. And he picks wives that are of that nature. So, but things are still okay between Isaac and Rivka because they're both bothered by this. But then as we leap forward into the next chapter, Isaac sort of changes a little bit. And it's very subtle there. It's not so subtle in the Zohar and the Midrash and the Talmud, right? Like that. So the stories of the Midrash and so on are that, Isaac was Esau was really getting stronger and stronger in his ways, of left side ways, and he was sort of more and more bloodthirsty and a womanizer and things like that, right? But and when he decided to marry these women, he picked women of his own ilk. And the Midrash refers to other scripture that relate to sort of the old analogy of, a birds of a feather flock together, or more specifically, a raven, sits amongst other ravens. So the idea here is that his nature, his birth nature, in the Veda called Prakriti, the nature you're born with, which you're not stuck with. I mean, you have then the obligation of tikkun and healing and becoming, of this, what we call of the right side of wisdom and mercy and kindness. Everyone has that opportunity, regardless of how steep they are in severity. So Esau is getting more and more, abusive to not just neighbors and wives of neighbors, but people uh, and animals. And that's what the stories say. It's not in the Torah like that. Um, but the mistake that Isaac makes as we just cross the border from chapter 26 to 27, according to the Midrash and the Zohar, he begins to justify Esau's actions. This is an important instruction to us, both when we're being self-reflective, and also when we're looking at people around us or whatever's going on in our circle of life or worldview. We don't want to wind up justifying cruelty or severe behavior for reward, right? And if you look more deeply at that first verse, you can see that basically Isaac is calling Esau his son and saying, hey, take all that manly man stuff that you have gathered together and go out and get me some good food. So he has a benefit, and you can understand it from Isaac's point of view, right? Because we learn in the Midrash that Jacob is studying with not only with his mom, but with Shem and Eber in their tents, and he's studying meditation and the letters and all these things, and that's not usually um, the fruits of that aren't on the surface. They're not easy to see. There are very practical fruits from those endeavors, but they're not things that are quick and easy or surface to experience. And the other side, Esau, is going out and, you know, he can steal whatever he wants because he's strong, and he's gathered people around him who are very strong. He can bring home the bacon, so to speak. So Isaac, more and more, and you have to understand, Isaac was also born from that side, and it was Revka that brought him to the side of mercy. So his ilk, or the birds of a feather, will tend to flock together. So he sees this in Esau, and he justifies it. So I'm just going to read from the Midrash exactly what it says. So in a self-reflective way, certainly when we do things that take us away from the righteousness of Jacob, and our studies and our meditations and our prayers and our charities, when those things that take us away from that into, I got to have this and I got to have that, that lend itself to um, severity and ultimately cruelty. Um, when we see that in ourselves, we have to keep that in check and not justify it, because there's a million ways to rationalize and justify bad behavior, right? There's always ways. You know, you're always saving the world somehow, or saving something somehow with your act of cruelty. But the fact is, in the world of Kabbalah, the energy of cruelty, no matter what rationalization you have for it or justification you have for it, is an act of cruelty, right? You can make up stories, you can tie it to some kind of religion or philosophy, but at the end of the day, bad energy and cruel energy is bad energy and cruel energy, and there's no justification for it. So if we go to the Midrash on this, once again, the Midrash is a collective of stories around the Torah portions and Torah verses, right? So it says, it repeats the Torah portion that I just read, it, and it came to pass that when Isaac was old, and Rabbi Isaac began his lecture in this way. He justified the wicked for a reward. Whoever accepts a reward and justifies the wicked eventually finds himself realized in the same way. And if he take away righteousness of the righteous from him, for the righteous of the righteous, alludes to, as Moses said, and take away from him. Take away from him alludes to Isaac because he justified the wicked. As a result of him justifying the wicked, his eyes grew dim. And it came to pass that when Isaac was old, his eyes were dim. So if we look at it from that perspective, that instruction is pretty clear that that which unites us with the essence of all things, anything we can do to bring that to our awareness is righteous. Those things that take us away from that, regardless of whether we're born from the left side or the right side or whatever, those things damage our ability to experience the essence within ourselves and within everything around us. So it's our obligation to be inclined, as it says in the Psalms, towards the right, or in Shir HaShirim, I have gathered my myrrh with my spices. You gather in the myrrh. Myrrh is a red herb that comes in a spice that is gathered into the spices. So the left side is gathered in, or that discussion of the Shekinah, north wind blowing to the south and coming into the garden. So these things are instructive to us. But when we get to the Zohar, it does another form of instruction in comparing Abraham and Isaac. And, you know, in that comparison, it talks about how as Abraham got older, of course, he suffered the same problem of age that Isaac suffered. I'm sure he didn't have 20/20 vision when he was older, but in a spiritual sense, his awareness grew and expanded as opposed to being endarkened. So if we use this Star Wars language, you know, he was expanding his consciousness from the side of light, not from the side of darkness. And I'm going to read that from the Zohar and then talk a little bit about it. And it came to pass that when Isaac was old, his eyes were dimmed. It is written, and God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. For all the works of the Almighty are manifestations of truth and contain deep lessons. And all the words of the Torah assist us in our faith and are deeply symbolical. Observe now that Isaac was not so fortunate as Abraham, whose eyes were not blinded nor dimmed. Herein is a profound lesson touching faith, as has already been explained elsewhere by the light. Here is meant Abraham, who was the light of the day and whose light keeps on expanding and growing stronger like that of the day. Hence it is written, and when Abraham was old, he was advancing in days. This is an illumination, and as he grew older, his light continued to expand so that he was shining more and more like the perfect day. On the other hand, the darkness is a description of Isaac, who represents darkness and night. And hence, when he was old, his eyes were dim, so that he could not see. He had to become enveloped in darkness in order to become attached to his proper grade. So there's a couple of interesting things there. One is that, I think I explained what it says here just before I read it, but it also says here that he had to be enveloped in darkness. Interesting. To be connected to his proper grade. So I spoke to David about this because I wanted to, his Hebrew is better than mine. And we collaborated on digging a little deeper in the Zohar into the Hebrew. And what we found was that the words used here, the word especially for darkness, is a reflective verb, meaning that the subject and object are the same. So the action is performed by the subject and reflected back to the subject. So it's a reflective verb in that way. So it may have been better, I'm reading the Sansino translation. It may have been better to translate it, he enveloped himself in darkness, rather than he had to be engulfed in darkness. So it wasn't that it was a predestined thing for him to be darkness because that was his grade. Because that would contradict the lesson that the Zohar is teaching us in the idea of Revka bringing him into the side of mercy and kindness. It would say, well, he had no choice. And now the whole cascade of consequences of Esau and him justifying Esau is not relevant. But having said that, I want to say that there's something really nice about the idea of acceptance and the idea of, things ultimately. So there's this paradox in Kabbalistic mysticism, which is things are always exactly the way they're supposed to be. But at the same time, we're responsible to create harmony where there isn't harmony. We're responsible to be like Moses and Rephidim and lift up each other and all of creation and have healing. So things unfold in this way. And it's really kind of cool to understand that the process of unfoldment is part of the enlightenment. So that if Isaac didn't fall, if his eyes didn't grow dim, if he didn't return to his grade after being drawn in from Revka, he wouldn't have the same battle and Jacob also wouldn't have the same battle that we'll look into as we follow this along. And that wrestling and that battle is it's embedded in that process is the enlightenment. That's why shortcuts aren't real enlightenments. If you can take a pill and then experience complete unity, that's wonderful. But it's not real because it shortcuts the process. And what happens in the process is embedded in the enlightenment so that it's permanent. It becomes a part of you and your consciousness and who you are, not a one-time experience induced by something outside of you and the work that you have to do. Nobody can do your klipot for you. You're the only one that can drill through. And the Zohar actually quotes Proverbs 27, penetrate wisdom and build your house there. So Hakmah, like we started the lesson with, Shloshim V'Shtayim Netivot Hakmah, is that wisdom. We have to penetrate into that wisdom. And that's where we build our lives. That's where we build our house, right? That's our honeycomb. Right? That's where our honey is. That's where it's stored. That's the joy of our lives. So in this case, I think the Zohar allows us to have empathy with Isaac, allows us to say, okay, you can understand that Revka had brought him in, he had all these blessings, he had all this experience, but it's still in his prakriti, it's still in his nature to be of the side of severity, and he sees his son like that. So when the Zohar says, he wasn't so fortunate as Abraham, I think that creates empathy for us, for Isaac, because Abraham was born of the right side, was born of Hakmah and Chesed. That was his nature, always was his nature. He brought Sarah into that nature, drew her in. It wasn't always Revka's nature right from the beginning, but very early on, she made it her nature. She penetrated wisdom and made her house there. So Revka and Abraham are very unique in that regard. So if you look at it like Isaac wasn't as fortunate as Abraham, and you look at the dialectic and you look at how everything is the way it's supposed to be, it's paradoxical, but these two things exist at the same time. That we can say there's a necessity for darkness, but we cling to the light and we walk in the light and we want to be beacons of the light. Those two things can exist at the same time, right? Like that. So then further in the Zohar, we get, so it says he had to become enveloped in the darkness in order to become attached to his own proper grade. As David pointed out, perhaps that might be better translated. He enveloped himself in the darkness. So he has some responsibility. He made choices. And as a reflective nature, we don't want to make rationalization for our choices. We don't want to make rationalization for it or be connected with anything that has severe judgment and cruelty or severe anything. We want to be connected with kindness and mercy and wisdom and charity, right? And that's what we want to lean into. So then it says, Rabbi Eleazar, his son, came and kissed his hand. He said, now I understand. Abraham was bathed in the light from the side of his grade, whereas Isaac became wrapped in darkness from the side of his grade. But why is it written of Jacob, and the eyes of Israel, Jacob's other name, were heavy for age? Rabbi Simeon answered, it is written they were heavy, but not they were dim. It is not written for his old age, but for old age. This refers to the old age of Isaac and implying that his eyes were heavy as a result of the sight of Isaac. But they were only so heavy as to prevent him from seeing perfectly, but not dim. Whereas Isaac's eyes were altogether dimmed so that darkness settled upon him and night took hold of him. until to him he could be applied the words, and the darkness he called night. So we're looking at three figures here and the continuum of them. So in a sense, Abraham's mission on the earth was not as arduous as Jacob's. So Jacob's mission on the earth was more arduous because in both the inner and outer world, he had the arduous task of maintaining the equanimity between the left and the right. So he bore the heaviness of Isaac and Esau his whole life. He wrestled his whole life. It wasn't something that was easy. So by the end of his life, he was tired. And the weight of all of that wrestling was the weight that was on his eyes. But we're going to go forward now, next time we gather, and look at that wrestling and look at the instruction that we can derive from that wrestling as we wrestle ourselves in our walk.